Randy Mosher joins me this week to discuss kilning and roasting malts. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 271. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 271, and it's early December 2022. Randy Mosher joins me this week to discuss kilning and roasting malts. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Are you thinking about opening your own brewery? Craft Brewing and Magazine is sponsoring a brewery workshop in Fort Collins, Colorado, where you can connect with experts who have built successful breweries. The workshop runs from 26 February to 1 March 2023, and this is your opportunity to learn from the pros. For more information, visit breweryworkshop.com. Again, that's breweryworkshop.com. And Blickman Engineering has been the pioneer of nano brewing, and they've helped hundreds of successful breweries achieve their dreams. Starting with one-barrel systems in 2006 and now offering brew houses up to 15 barrels with cellaring equipment, keg washers, grain mills, and more. They are all sized specifically for the nano brewer. Blickman Pro systems are competitively priced without sacrificing quality. When you're ready to go pro, be sure to reach out to them. For expert advice, email them at proseries@blickmanengineering.com. Again, that's proseries@blickmanengineering.com. And I launched a new version of the BeerSmith forum a couple months ago, as well as made some significant security upgrades. The BeerSmith discussion forum is a place where you can discuss all things brewing, including techniques, ingredients, equipment, pro brewing, and our BeerSmith recipe software. Join the conversation today at beersmith.com/forum. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, I welcome back Randy Mosher. Randy is the author of the books Mastering Homebrew, Radical Brewing, and Tasting Beer. He's also a partner in two breweries near Chicago, Five Rabbit and Forbidden Root. Randy, it's great to have you back on the show. How are you doing today?
Great to be back, Brad. I'm doing well. It's my birthday, so we're going to go out and celebrate.
Happy birthday to you. I heard it was a big 7-0. Is that true?
It is. Yeah, it is.
That is a significant milestone.
Yeah, it is. The breweries are doing, we've recovered from COVID and, just getting the numbers built back up. So we have two breweries in Chicago proper, one close to downtown and one a little bit more on the north side. And then we have another brewery in Columbus, Ohio. We just won a medal there for it was an oak age saison at the Festival of Wood and Barrel Aged Beers here in Chicago, which is kind of a national event. But
and those are on a which label? Because I know you have two labels, and one of them is kind of you were trying to move to another location or something.
They're all Forbidden Root.
Okay. The
second Chicago location we call Cultivate by Forbidden Root, just to distinguish it a little bit.
Oh, nice.
We do a little more farmhousey. We've got a wood fooder, things like that. So we're a little bit we have a slightly different beer character up there, but we do share beers between all three breweries too.
And Forbidden Root has a certain focus, if I recall, right?
We started as a botanical brewing that sort of still serves as our inspiration. Our biggest selling beer, for example, is a strawberry basil Hefeweizen out in the market. And so we do a lot of beers that have just a little touch of something different in it. We try and make beers that are unique and creative, but also really drinkable and just a bit different from everybody else. So.
And then Five Rabbit had a different focus, and I think that you mentioned that one's on hold, or you're looking for a new location right now.
Yeah, Five Rabbit. We were basically kind of a production brewery with a tap room. The brewery's a little oversized for our current distribution, so we sold the equipment off and are on hiatus right now. We're in the process of getting a brew pub concept going in the neighborhood on the near south side called Pilsen, which ironically is the biggest Mexican neighborhood in Chicago. So we're working with a developer on that. So not sure what the plans are for that as far as opening time, but
and Five Rabbit had a South American twist to it, right?
Yeah, my main partner's from Costa Rica, and his wife's from Peru, and we had people, others involved that were from Mexico and Argentina, and so it was a pan-Latin kind of idea. Really, the first Latin-themed brewery in the U.S., craft brewery in the U.S. So
Awesome. And then I assume you're still doing some writing and designing as well?
a little bit of designing, mainly for my own breweries. And then I'm now a little past the 3-year mark of full-time work on a new book. We finally have a title for it. It's called Your Tasting Brain, How It Works and How to Use It. So it's really a very deep dive into the science and neuroscience and everything else revolving around taste, smell, mouthfeel, flavor, language, and then practical advice. So it's for anybody. Obviously, beer people will be interested in it, but wine people interested in food and gastronomy, I think, I wrote it because I wanted to read it, and there isn't a book like it. So we're hoping for great things on it. So,
well, obviously you did the book Tasting Beer, but this one is more just taste in general, right? It's not focused necessarily on beer, right?
Obviously, I talk about beer because it's a thing I know about, and it's important, and people care about it. But it really, the bulk of the book is really talking about you, and how our brains work, how we create sensations and interpret them and remember them and act on them. And, then eventually I'm working right now on the vocabulary chapter. Just started this morning writing about wine, which is kind of hilarious for me.
Wow.
To write about a beer guy writing about wine. So I'm on my best behavior.
Yeah.
That. So,
we appreciate that.
Yeah. So anyway, it should be 2024. I'm expecting, because it's going to be a fairly long editorial process because it's a university press. So
it's a big book too, I think, right?
But if anybody's interested, reach out to me via email, and I'll put them on the list for a little bit of a preview email that I'm going to be sending out about the first of the year every couple of weeks.
And your website again, just so people can reach out.
RandyMosher.com.
RandyMosher.com. There you go.
Click through to my email through there. So.
Cool. Well, today you want to talk about dark malts, and specifically some of the important flavors that go on that are developed during kilning and malting and the processes around that. Why are these toasted and roasted flavors so important for beer?
Well, everything that goes into beer is important, and every little step of the process is important. So, I think generally the chemistry and botany and processing of the raw ingredients are not as familiar to most brewers as they ought to be, and that's, I think that includes professional breweries and home brewers alike. I think, it's easy to sort of go to the store and get what you want and bring it home and make beer and become familiar with them to some degree. But if you understand a little bit more about the process behind them, it puts them into a framework that expands your choices and makes it easier to decide which to use in what kind of situation. So I think they're a little bit underappreciated. So I like to, part of my mission always has been trying to get people to dig a little deeper. Or I'll dig a little deeper, and now here's some information for you. So that's what I've been trying to do.
So I believe you've been exploring things like the Maillard reaction and caramelization and some of these other processes. Can you, just at a high level, talk about the major processes and when they occur?
Yeah, we'll go into more detail, but basically you have 3 processes. One is called caramelization. It happens when you put sugar in a pan on the stove and turn the heat on, right? And at a certain point, it starts smelling different. It develops some color, and you really have quite different products at the end than the beginning. Requires nothing else than basically sugar and heat. So then that happens. That occurs in brewing, in all kilning, but it's especially the primary source of flavors in caramel malts, for reasons I'll explain later.
Yeah.
The second process is Maillard. Now, Maillard is this enormous tangle of complex reactions that can start even at relatively low temperatures. It's actually a problem in the food industry with things like fruit juices that darken over time. If you ever had an old carton of orange juice or something that's a little brown, that's Maillard going on, right? And so, but that can go up to fairly high temperatures, and it produces an enormous range of different kinds of chemicals, different types of chemicals, different specific molecules within those types, And at each temperature range, with each combination of starting ingredients and process conditions, you end up with different output. And it also makes some color compounds that don't really have any aroma but make dark beer dark. And then the third process, when you get to a certain temperature point, you have this process called pyrolysis. And as you might guess from the name, it's basically carbonizing the carbon, burning up the carbon skeletons that are from the sugars that are the starting materials. And so you really, with pyrolysis, you're going to get a lot of that going on in the darkest of malts. And so, which is why they get those sort of burnt campfire kind of characteristics.
So that's kind of, especially the higher end roasted malts, right?
That would be just really your roasted malts.
Yeah.
The chocolate malts, and especially the black malts and the roasted malts.
So, Randy, can you tie those three processes to sort of the color wheel and how we see things develop, from low temperature kilning all the way up to high temperature roasting?
Well, in terms of color, it's a little bit indirect because with both caramelization and Maillard processes, you can have products that barely have any color at all that have a lot of aroma, especially with Maillard. But at very high temperatures, you really develop a ton of color. And as I understand it, most of the color actually comes from Maillard. Caramelization, you're basically creating carbon and burning away and volatilizing a lot of molecules. So you're not really generating a lot of additional color through the burning processes, at least as far as I've been able to find. But the flavors are dramatic, at different temperature ranges.
So, Randy, why don't we start with caramelization, only because it's a little bit simpler than some of the other reactions. Can you tell us about caramelization, some of the chemistry that goes on there, and the rough temperature range where it happens?
Yeah, caramelization starts, I don't know, somewhere around a little over 200 degrees Fahrenheit. The easiest way to kind of experience this is to literally just put some white sugar in a saucepan, in a heavy pan, and turn the heat on kind of medium, and don't stir it much because you'll get the sugar to start to crystallize, which you don't want to do. But just let it go, and pay attention with your nose. Even before it starts to change color, you'll start to develop like a kind of a kettle corn type of aroma. And then as you cook it a little more, you get more like maybe a little bit of like caramel corn kind of notes, or really, and especially like burnt raisin and sort of dried fruit and burnt raisin kind of characters. And then eventually you'll get sort of like the raisin on the bottom of the cookie that's a little bit like kind of slightly, not really burnt, but kind of really pretty toffee-like and caramelized. And those are really characteristic process things. At the very light end are chemicals called, let's see, what are they? They're at the very light end of the range are these chemicals called Strecker degradation products, or Strecker aldehydes. And these have really strong kind of malty, lightly caramelized malty types of flavors. If you ever just smell a fairly pale colored malt, like a pale ale, you just get that very nice, pleasant maltiness in there. That's actually, there's a lot of chemicals, but one of them is called maltol, and there's another called isomaltol. And there's some other chemicals called these aldehydes, 2-methylbutanol and 3-methylbutanol, and those have like very strongly, just very simple kind of malt ball types of aromas. And so that's really kind of where it starts. And again, as it ramps up, you start to get more of these sort of a little bit more like these dried fruit kind of compounds as the temperature goes up. And eventually you're full on kind of burnt marshmallow.
And we associate a lot of these flavors with caramel crystal malts. Can you explain why the caramel crystal malts, have this higher sugar content and are more prone to this caramelization?
Right. Yeah. So caramel malts are done they're malted the same, but when it comes to kilning them, they're done in a completely different way. So rather than being normal, like all malts, before even the darkest malts, before they're roasted, they go through a kilning process, basically, or it's called withering, where you're basically just very lightly heating them up to blow off moisture. And when you get the moisture content down to, I don't know, 5%, 7%, something like that, then you begin the kilning process. And actually that malting or that moisture content is really critical when you go into the Maillard process, because higher amounts of moisture will produce more sweet aromatics, like the difference between Munich malt and amber or biscuit malt. In addition to maybe the biscuit malt's a little darker, but it's going to be sharp, pungent, more toasty, whereas the Munich and dark Munich and melanoidin type malts are going to be more cookie-like. So they have a sweet aspect, right? And that moisture level is critical.
So that's what's driving that?
Yeah, that's what's driving that. Again, the moisture, like all the parameters, pH, moisture, concentration, sugar content, and amino acids in particular for Maillard are really key for the outcome, which is why things like, coffee tastes different than malt, because coffee starts with different things and a different mix of amino acids and stuff that eventually get transformed in this process. But with Maillard, you don't have any of the amino acids. It's just, and so crystal malt, they rather than drying it first, they mash it first.
Right. So I always describe it, they kind of mash the grain while it's still in the husk, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So they go through that like 150 degrees C or Fahrenheit kind of temperature range where the carbohydrates in the starches in the kernels actually convert to sugars, to maltose sugars. And so what that means now is that you have a very high amount of what are called reducing sugars, which are simple sugars. And those are what the caramelization reaction primarily operates with.
Right, and that's why we get the figs and the dried raisins and those other fruity flavors out of the caramel malt, right?
Exactly, yeah, because you have all this. And in addition, they start really roasting it at a fairly high moisture content, which furthers the development of those sort of rich, sweet, caramely, and then eventually fruity, and then slight and toffee, and into like a little bit of sort of burnt fruit or really toasted fruit. And eventually then that kind of burnt marshmallow, like, what happens in the malt is exactly what happens when you put that marshmallow on the stick and hold it over the fire, that you get that those really sharp, pungent, roasty flavors. Right. Makes them hard to use, in my opinion. That you have to be really careful. I think generally with crystal malt, there was a time when almost every single craft beer recipe brewed in the United States had a big chunk of crystal malt in it.
That's true.
And I think it was because early on, there was so much extract brewing, and extract was always deficient in malt aroma because it just sucked a lot of that stuff out when it was concentrated. And I think all the homebrewers kind of got in the habit of adding a pound of crystal to 5 gallons of beer, and that was so much a part of all the early, the Sierra Nevada type of IPAs and things like that, or pale ales. Very heavily dependent on crystal. It's a really kind of that.
Right. I mean, obviously the crystals were heavily used in a lot of the English beers. They were imitating at the time, the pale ale.
Yeah. And crystal, crystal's really interesting. It's a long sought to find the origin of crystal malt, and I can't really come up with anything. There's a guy named Stopes that wrote a big book on malting I think it was in the 1860s. That's like this thick, huge book on malting, and he mentions crystal and says it's from a patent long expired.
Interesting.
And at that point, and you don't really find it in the old recipes very often, but once they start making the lighter gravity bitters, that's where it really came in useful, because it has a ton of flavor for the weight, and so you really add a lot of complexity. And of course, those British bitters, we sort of idolize them as like, these pure things that are malty and all of that, but really they're as adjunct laden as any American adjunct lager. The other thing is that they're really pretty low in alcohol. A strong one is 4.5%, so or thereabouts, and the weaker ones are in the low threes.
A lot of them really came into their own during the wars, World War I and World War II. So. And things were in short supply, so things were done, Especially
World War I, and of course, England had the same prohibitionist kind of activities over there that we did here, but they never succeeded in banning alcohol. Partially, I think, because they didn't have a large German population brewing beer there, which was one of the things. And when World War I hit, that was one of the things that just pushed prohibition over the hump. It's like, oh yeah, now we're fighting these bloody Germans, So it was just enough reason for the general public to kind of go along with the scheme, I think.
Interesting.
But that's another subject. So Crystal,
history, we could go on for quite some time. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Randy.
No, that's okay.
Yeah. Well, I want to move on maybe to the Maillard reaction, which is quite a bit more complicated, but it's really central to a lot of the dark malt flavors.
Yeah.
How does this reaction occur? What are some of the processes going on? And as you mentioned, this has a huge temperature range where it happens.
Right. So when you look at the a chart of them, even a really simplified chart, and I put these in several of my books because I think it's kind of an amazing thing just to understand how crazy complex these things are. You realize it's just it's a crazy tangle of chemical reactions that combine to form this whole system. One really interesting thing about Maillard that's relevant here is that human beings are extraordinarily sensitive to some of its products. There's a story, I came across in a journal article about a researcher who was working on just studying rats' responses to different groups of flavor chemicals I forget what he was even trying to figure out. But the lab assistants started complaining about these nasty, terrible, caramely smelling chemicals and it turned out that rats could hardly smell them. So that put them on a kind of a quest to sort of sort that out a little bit and look at maybe what the receptors are. And it turns out that human beings and Neanderthals share the receptors, but the last group of sort of proto-humans called the Denisovans before that don't have them.
Interesting.
And so, it happened the earliest. Now there's just a recent article out. They found some evidence in Israel of some cooked seafood, I think it was, at 780,000 years ago. So all that has changed since the beginning of cooking. And, that's as early as we have evidence. It may go back to 1 million years or so, but probably not too much further back than that. And obviously 1 million years, to us, it's a long time, but in genetic evolutionary terms, it's a kind of a blink of an eye. And that just shows you how quickly our chemical sensory systems can adapt to new opportunities, new needs, because cooked foods provides a huge amount more nutrition on it provides us a lot more energy. We spend a lot of less energy digesting it. And so cooked food allowed an energy like excess, really, like extra energy that our bodies didn't need. So guess where we put it?
It's probably quite a bit safer too, right?
Well, there's that. But, animals eat food raw all the time. They can, vultures can eat rotting carcasses and stuff. So there's methods to eat food that's, we would consider in our sanitized world to be not very healthy. But really, all that excess energy that we were taking in went straight to the development of our brain. And so, it's one of the things that led us to be these, cognitive creatures that we are. Just that. And of course, that's really valuable. So being sensitive to those aromas is really important because, you can smell food cooking a mile away. We're literally, I drive around Chicago all the time. It's like, oh, there's French fries. Oh, there's hamburgers. There's, and that's like a block away from stuff. So.
Well, walk us through the process itself. What happens in a Maillard reaction? I always think of like throwing a piece of toast in the toaster, but can you walk us through some of the chemical processes going on?
Yeah, let me organize my thoughts here. Yeah, so basically, at the beginning, you're creating these things called Strecker aldehydes, and those are things that are lightly malted. You can actually get those through caramelization also. So those early flavors are not super different, and those tend to be like those kind of light caramelized caramel corn, or really like that kettle corn thing is a perfect example for me. Spun sugar is a term that's also used, and those are really important, and those are pretty robust, and they tend to stay in the mix for quite a while. And actually, those are really important in certain fruits and things too, because Maillard can form at physiological temperatures. So, say, for example, strawberry has a chemical called the strawberry furanone, which is one of those Strecker aldehydes, or one of those early chemicals. I don't think it's an aldehyde, but so at the beginning, you get these very light, caramelly kind of spun sugar sorts of things, and then you move into a different stage where you're basically taking, because you're starting with sugar molecules, which are basically like either 5-sided or 6-sided carbon rings as their skeletons. And then you're also taking amino acids from proteins or other kinds of things, and you're breaking those amino acids down. And the amino acids have nitrogen and oxygen and occasionally sulfur in them. So you're basically creating 3 classes of chemicals that are collectively termed heterocyclic molecules. And so cyclic, that's just referring to that hexagonal or pentagonal ring, and the hetero part means, like, hetero literally means like foreign or different. So a sugar is just carbon, 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 carbon. But hetero means on one or more of those ring points, there's an oxygen molecule or atom, or a nitrogen, or a sulfur. And each of those have somewhat different aroma characteristics and form in different ways and in different parts of the kilning process. So the oxygen components are the ones that sort of form first. So you get chemicals called furans and pyrans. I mean, there's a chemical called furfural that has sweet, caramel, nutty, bread-like, even a bit almondy. And then you have a big group of chemicals called furanones. That's that strawberry one. That's also found in peaches, as a bit of that furanone. So if you're eating a peach or a strawberry, look for that caramelized thing. And we're actually using that. We're working on a formulation for a peach beer right now, and we're going to use a little caramel 10, because we can get just a bit of that, very light caramelized sort of flavor into that, which might help kind of support that peach flavor. Nice. So we're trying that. We'll see what happens. Beer's in the tank right now. And then so these furanones, again, have lots of sort of really what you would think of as like strongly caramel notes. There's one called sotalone that actually is a maple odor that's responsible for a lot of the flavor of maple syrup. And then you get to so the oxygen compounds form at the lowest temperature, medium low, and then as you step up the temperature, the oxygen or the nitrogen compounds form, which are by far the largest category that you're going to find in malts and the more darkly roasted things. So, and almost all of these chemicals, especially the nitrogen ones, have names that have a PYR in them, right? And if you think about pyre, it's a Greek word that literally means fire. So those are chemical names that were given to reflect the nature of their sort of cooked and toasted, roasted kind of thing. So pyrols, 2-acetyl pyrrole is nutty, bread, walnut, licorice, and then the pyrazines is probably the largest. In fact, the largest and most important group of flavor chemistry in all of cooked food are pyrazines. So, and typically you'll find descriptions of nuts, bread, slightly burned notes, roasted notes, bready, roasty, nutty, and actually pyrazines again can also form in biological conditions. So there's a chemical called methoxypyrazone or pyrazine that is that green pepper note that you get in green peppers, but it's also that sort of famous varietal character note in Cabernet Sauvignon grapes. And so, so what's interesting is like you have all these sort of caramely, toffee, all of these nutty hazelnut, peanut descriptors, but every now and then you'll have some weird outlier that's like shellfish or vegetable or something that like comes from nowhere. These are the chemicals, you know. That's the magic. That's the magic of the way foods are put together. You know, you'll get like a greasy potato chip character in chocolate, for example, you know, and if you take it out, the chocolate falls apart, you know, like smell wise, right? So sometimes there's a lot of these weird notes that you wouldn't think would be central, but turns out they're really important for the overall character of foods, and they, you know, they work together with other chemicals, and they don't necessarily preserve their own their own aromas that we might perceive individually, because so much of aroma is just the way a certain group of molecules presents a pattern to our brain as a whole, and you know, so everything kind of gets blended in ways that we wouldn't, like counterintuitive ways, non-additive ways.
And one of the cool things I think is all these things, they kind of pile up on each other too, don't they? All these compounds, all these complicated compounds you've been talking about.
Yeah. So what happens is, you know, basically you can think of the roasting process and again, kilning, they just dry things out, and all of your base malts up to about Munich malt or even a melanoidin or dark Munich malt, those are all done in a kiln. So the temperatures are really much milder, much slower process. You do get all of this Maillard development, but it doesn't get to the high stages. And in the roasting process, you really are literally putting grain that's already been dried for the most part into a coffee roaster, right? And cranking it up, and you're controlling that temperature. So as those temperatures go up, you go through wave after wave after wave of different kind of chemical formation, and at the same time, like when you pull it out of the roaster, determines kind of what the mix is, because some chemicals simply volatilize off. You know, if you put stuff in a pan and heat it, you can smell it in your kitchen, and that means it's no longer in the pan.
Right.
So some of it just simply gets just driven off by heat. Some of it actually, you know, the things that are created in one stage of the process, those streccharaldehydes, for example, those become feedstock for the heterocyclics. So if you're developing a lot of heterocyclics, you're also drawing down on your supply of these streccharaldehydes, right? So, and then when you get to pyrolysis, now you've got actual like carbonization going, and it's really destroying a lot of chemical molecules. So it's really a matter of like stuff's building up, and then stuff's like, as the same time certain things are building up, other things that were created earlier are actually going away. So
maybe we could just dive into pyrolysis for a minute and talk about that process.
Yeah. So pyrolysis really happens kind of right at the end of the process, and it occurs like 300 degrees and up, you know, or maybe not quite 300 degrees, but it's sort of that stage in coffee roasting where it starts to really start to smell burned, and it's pushing out a lot of really nasty, harsh volatiles. And, you know, that's one of the reasons that malt is typically, and coffee too, for example, they say, is that it's best after roasting to leave it to rest for a few days, because there's some of these very, like if you've ever been around roasting coffee, it's not pleasant, right? It has a lot of really harsh, nasty campfire, smoky kind of things that are just blowing off. And those are not things you really want in coffee. And so it's best, if you're ever going to do any of this yourself, which is, I would highly recommend, it's actually quite fun to do, and try different, you know, sprinkle the malt with water a little bit before you roast it and try different temperatures. I went through a whole series of that for a book earlier on. And but that's really kind of fun to do. And you can make malts that you can't get available, but you'll find that they smelled like hell, especially if you're roasting them fairly dark. And then also it's best to just let them sit for a couple of weeks in a paper bag or something where they can gas off a little bit. I think coffee, they recommend like 3-4 days or so to mellow it out a little bit before it's like really at its peak.
So stepping back for a minute, what are some of the major flavors we might associate with each of the three major processes?
Well, Really, with caramelization, it's going to be those very, very light ones and very light caramel, those sort of spun sugar kind of flavors, um, caramel, maybe caramel corn a little bit. And then you start getting into kind of light raisins and medium raisins, and then finally prunes and figs and all of that kind of dark stuff. And then at some point, those start to get a little more toasty, and you're going to develop more of those like really literally cooked sugar and ultimately burnt marshmallow. In this famous Special B, I think somebody's still making that, right?
Oh yeah,
yeah. That really is that burnt marshmallow. In fact, we make a toasted marshmallow Schwarzbier at Forbidden Root, and we use I think it's a Crystal 80 to get that kind of toasted note in there, and it's pretty effective in that situation for us. And then with Maillard, it's really that full range, but particularly pyrazine. So think about roasted hazelnuts, roasted peanuts. The caramel stuff comes earlier at lower temperatures, and then you get into these sort of roasted, nutty kind of things, and then you start to really develop like full-on roasted type of characters.
Right, and that's that third process you were talking about, right?
Yeah, and pyrolysis. I mean, it's not really clear to me. I don't have a lot of good like molecular descriptors on the pyrolysis things. To me it seems more of a destructive process than anything else, and so it's removing a lot of that other stuff that's kind of more caramelly, more pleasant, and really leaving you with just the most intensely kind of burned kind of flavors left. Which is why I think to my mind, one of the important things about brewing stouts is to just to not make them simply about the darkest malts, because they've lost a lot of those more complex, more interesting, more sort of sweet aroma characteristics. So if you can add those back either with some caramel malts or some Munich, or use a base malt like a mild ale base malt rather than a pale ale base malt that has the mild's a little bit more like a Vienna that has a little more sweet caramelly type of quality to it.
No, I agree. I always encourage people that are making darker beers, porters, and stouts to put in layers of flavor, not just, you don't want just black patent or just chocolate malt. Yeah. You want the intermediate flavors, because they support and give you that that layered flavor in the finished beer that just makes it so much more robust.
Yeah, I mean we drink with our eyes, and to some extent we brew with our eyes too, but you got to really be aware of those flavors, which I think is why that, thinking about it that way is really important.
Yeah. At the very top end, we have roast barley, or also called stout roast, which is very distinctive, and then it's made from unmalted barley. Can you talk about how that is a little bit different than some of the other dark malts?
Right. So the real difference is that roasted barley is very much higher in pyrazines than roasted malt. And the reason for that is that during the malting process, a lot of the larger molecular weight products, certainly the nitrogenous products, the proteins, are being broken down. It's because you have these protease and proteinase enzymes operative in malting, and to some extent those are engaged in malting and in mashing as well. Mm-hmm. But you're breaking down these large components into small components, and the small components are the ones that really more thoroughly engage in those processes in the earlier stage to create the aldehydes that have those like very nice sweet character, caramelic type of things, whereas the pyrazines are much more of the roasty kind of compounds, and like roasted nuts and that sort of thing. And so because the black malt hasn't gone through the malting process, it still has the starting ingredients for this process of Maillard are really, really different than, even though it's the same grain, the chemistry is different because it hasn't been malted. And so you tend to have a much higher relative proportion of pyrazines in the black malts in the roasted barleys than you do in the black malts.
Interesting. Really, the interview wouldn't be complete if I didn't talk about the harsh zone, which is something that you kind of coined. Runs roughly between 70 Lovibond and 200 Lovibond. Why are there so few malts made in this range, and why are the malts in this range so harsh?
Well, I think basically it's it's just this process that we talked about where flavors are piling up and piling up, and at the bottom end of that range, you're starting to get a lot of these really roasty and even harsh pyrazines and other compounds, and as the temperature, as you continue to cook and the temperature goes up, you start to blow some of those off. And so you really volatilize off some of the harsher ones. And that's, again, when you do that, you can smell those in the air, or you can certainly smell it in coffee roasting. Coffee is stinky when you're roasting it. And that's because you're blowing that stuff off. But that's a good thing, because then you by the time you come out on the other end, out of the end of that harsh zone, you have a lot mellower and more usable product. So it's just, a recognition that those products, that kind of time temperature range in that color range between 80 and about 200 Lovibond is just unpleasant in beer. And I've brewed with them because early on I was doing a lot of experimental stuff, and I did malted, did roasted things, and I found that to be just absolutely true, that there's a good reason why they don't do them, because they're just pretty unpleasant.
Yeah, I mean, I still use them, but in very small quantities. So a couple percent to add, just a little bit of sharpness to the beer, but I certainly don't use a lot.
The only ones I knew about was the only ones I ever really saw on the market were a series of crystal malts. It was like a crystal 170 and a crystal 190, I think, from a company called Patagonia. I don't think they're distributed in the U.S. anymore, but we used them a lot at Five Rabbit. They were kind of signature malts for a couple of our dark beers. We really liked those, but because it's crystal malt and not regular malt, I think the chemistry was different enough that it didn't pose those same kind of problems.
Yeah.
But I verified it, with experiment.
Well, I mean, even Special B is kind of a crystal malt, right?
It is.
Yeah,
so
it's made from crystal
malt. But
base.
it's like used with care, because
exactly.
It's very potent.
Where does the astringency in the very dark malts come from?
I think the astringency is primarily from polyphenols. These are like polymers of phenols, like the name suggests, and those are tannic, and they don't really, they don't participate in the Maillard reaction at all, and then they start getting kind of burned up. So they tend to develop a lot of burned flavors. One of the couple things on the harsh aspect, roast, like the Weyermann Carafa malts, you can get in husked or unhusked, I believe. And the unhusked ones are mellower, and they don't have as much of that kind of sharpness that you find in the husked malt. And you can get dark versions of rye and wheat also, and I find those also are not, they're rounder and smoother. Mm-hmm. And I know, maltsters are really concerned about that harshness, and there are processes that they generally refer to as debittering, where they're actually spraying during roasting, they'll mist the roasting grains with a little bit of like a very light water mist. And what happens in that high temperature situation, that water hits the kernels and immediately turns to steam, and that steam creates a vacuum, which sucks out a lot of these harsh volatiles out of those grains.
Interesting.
And that's kind of the process for that, as I understand it.
Well, Randy, we're actually getting near the end of our time, but I wanted to get your closing thoughts on dark malt flavors and the processes that really take place during roasting and toasting.
Yeah, like anything in brewing, get your lips on it, get it in your mouth. And the easiest way to do that is to make malt tea. There's a process, where you can add, I don't know, like
I think it's the ASBC method. You can probably look it up, right?
Basically, you take an ounce of grain, crush it up, mix it with 3-4 ounces of water, make kind of a concentrated tea with it, and then let it steep for, 10 minutes or so. It doesn't take a lot of time. You could do it in an espresso machine if you have one. Grind it up fine and just run it through an espresso machine. It probably tastes best that way. And then with the lighter malts, with crystal malts, you can taste them by themselves, or you can blend them into a lighter beer. But with the dark malts, what I recommend doing is getting a neutral ale, or like a golden ale or a lager or something, just a simple beer, and add a spoonful or so of those dark malts into that beer, and that's a really good way to evaluate those flavors. We actually sat down at Forbidden Root, and we went through about 20 different black and chocolate malts to help us decide which ones would be good for coffee beer, which ones would be good for chocolate beer, and which ones would be good just for a stout where you're not really looking for particular chocolate and toffee. And we were shocked by, even within like black malt, how completely different the flavors were from manufacturer to manufacturer. So you can't make assumptions about, just because it's black malt doesn't mean it's the same as another black malt. And that's certainly doubly true for crystal.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great thing, great exercise to do with a group of people, your brew club or whatever. It's you can look up the ASBC method, I think is what it's called, ASBC sensory method, if you want to get the exact quantities to use and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, and you could do them in advance and stick them in mason jars and put them in your fridge and cool them down. And you don't want to wait too long because those flavors do degrade. But a week or two in advance is fine. And just bring them out. You can run them through a coffee filter. I forgot to mention that. Yeah. But it's pretty straightforward. It doesn't take any special equipment or anything really. And it's a great. We've done that. We did years ago. We did just a crystal malt tasting at the club meeting. We just spread out like 25 different kinds of crystal malt, let people just chew on them, and that's pretty revealing. It's better in the tea, I think, but even that was like, people were shocked at how different those were.
Yeah. Well, Randy, I really appreciate you coming on the show, and I want to say happy birthday to you again.
Thank you very much. Celebration begins right now.
It's great to have our my good friend Randy Mosher here on today. He's the author of the books Mastering Homebrew, Radical Brewing, and Tasting Beer, and of course, he's involved in 2 different breweries in the Chicago area. Randy, thank you again for having me.
And the new book.
I'm sorry. Oh, and the new book. I'm sorry. Title the new book again?
Your Tasting Brain.
Awesome. Well, Randy, thank you again. Great to have you on the show.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Brad. Appreciate it.
A big thank you to Randy Mosher for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. If you want to start your own brewery, join them in Colorado for their brewery workshop, where you can connect with experts who have built successful breweries. To sign up, go to breweryworkshop.com. Again, that's breweryworkshop.com. And Blickman Engineering has been the pioneer of nano brewing, and they've helped hundreds of successful breweries achieve their dreams. Starting with one-barrel systems back in 2006, they now offer brew houses up to 15 barrels with cellaring equipment, keg washers, grain mills, and more. They are sized specifically for the nano brewery. Blickman Pro systems are competitively priced, and they don't sacrifice quality. When you're ready to go pro, be sure to reach out to them for expert advice. Email them now at proseries@blickmanengineering.com. Again, that's proseries@blickmanengineering.com. And I launched a new version of the BeerSmith discussion forum a few months back, as well as made some significant security upgrades. The BeerSmith discussion forum is a place where you can discuss all things brewing, including techniques, ingredients, equipment, pro brewing, and our BeerSmith recipe software. Join the conversation today at beersmith.com/forum. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.